Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome to our seminar on policy implications of recent globalization research. This is the last seminar in this academic year, and it is my great pleasure to introduce Anna Maria Mayda, who will be our speaker today. Anna Maria is professor of economics at the School of Foreign Service and Department of Economics at Georgetown University. She is a world expert on international relation, but of course her research interests are broader and include international trade and political economy. Anna Maria is a fellow of CEPR as well as of ISA and other organizations. And today she's going to talk about the impact of immigration looking beyond the labor market. So it's a much broader topic. And so Anna Maria, it's fantastic to have you with us today. The floor is yours. We will go for about 40 minutes and then we will open the floor to questions. But if you have questions while Anna Maria is speaking, please type them in the Q&A and I will read them to her. Okay. Anna Maria, over to you.
Thank you very much, Beata, and thank you very much to everybody for the invitation to present. It's a pleasure to be here. Let me share my presentation and please confirm that you can see it. Good. So what I'm going to talk about today is the impact of immigration looking beyond the labor market. And my talk is going to be based on joint work, mainly with Mine Senses at Johns Hopkins University and Walter Steingras at Bank of Canada, as well as older work with Giovanni Facchini at University of Nottingham, Elie Murar, University of Alicante, and Giovanni Peri at UC Davis. So let me start with an introduction to this talk. Okay, let me see. Basically, to design an optimal migration policy, we need to know what the impact of migration is through all different channels. From an economic point of view, immigrants can affect wages and employment rates in labor markets. They can also affect other factor markets. And the literature on labor market effects of migration is really large, as I will talk about in the next slide. But immigration can also have an effect, a very important effect, through other channels. So, for example, differently from trade, from goods and services, immigrants can pay taxes, can send their kids to public schools, can use public services. In other words, immigrants can have an effect on the welfare state. They can have fiscal effects. They can also have an impact through markets of goods and services. So there is a very nice literature that looks at price effects of migration. A paper by Patricia Cortes for the United States, another paper that looks at the price effects and the labor market implication by Patricia Cortes and José Sada. There are also papers looking at the impact of migration on trade and FDI flows, on production patterns, on innovation, so broadly markets of goods and services. And finally, another channel that I think is quite important, and there is a relatively small literature on it, is the housing market. Next, from a non-economic point of view, migration has an impact from a cultural point of view in terms of security and crime, potentially, and through political effects. Now, moving on, as I was saying, the academic migration literature in economics has devoted a great deal of attention to the labor market. There is an extensive literature looking at the impact of migration on wages, employment rates, and so on. So, for example, to give you a sense of how much academics have worked in this literature, there are, according to Lozano and Steinberg, at least 145 studies published between 1990 and 2010 on the topic of migration and labor markets. And then since 2010, many more papers on the same topic have come out. So definitely the labor market channel is really important because voters worry quite a lot about labor market effects. But what I will claim in this presentation, I will try to make a strong case of it, is that other economic channels are also very important. And in particular, what I'm going to focus on is fiscal effects of immigration. So I'm going to make a case that fiscal effects are as important, if not more important, than labor market effects, especially from a policy point of view, which is the perspective that is relevant for this seminar. So let me give you an example. There is a very famous report by the National Academy of Science in the United States, which was published in 2016. And the title is The Economic and Fiscal Consequences of Immigration. This report looks at the economic impacts of migration, and it devotes 2 chapters to the labor market channel, 3 chapters to fiscal effects, and 1 chapter to all other economic impacts. So definitely seems like this report that was done for policy reasons is evidence that these fiscal effects really matter to policymakers, are really relevant from a policy point of view. Yet the academic literature on fiscal effects is way, way smaller than the labor market literature. And also importantly, from a methodological point of view, this literature uses approaches which are quite different from what has been used in the rest of the migration literature in economics. Now, before moving on with the presentation, let me clarify what we mean by fiscal effects. We mean the impact that the arrival of immigrants has on public revenues raised by the government, so in particular tax revenues, and as a consequence of that on provision of public goods and services, so all those goods and services that we receive as residents of a given country, and in general, the size of a country's welfare state. So the outline of the presentation is as follows. I will talk a lot about why I think fiscal effects are important. And in doing that, I will give you an overview of different parts of the migration literature that have touched upon the link between immigration and public finance. Next, I will talk about what exists right now in the literature on fiscal effects, in particular for the United States. I will next quite concisely present the results of new work of mine with Mine Senses and Walter Steingras on fiscal effects. And next, I will conclude giving talking about policy implications of the analysis of fiscal effects. Okay, so why are fiscal effects important? First of all, they're very important. They're crucial from a political point of view. So if you think about voters, each voter cares about disposable income, which is what goes into the budget constraint. And disposable income is income net of taxes. Each voter also cares about the possibility to use public goods and services that enter the utility function. And taxes on one side and public goods and services on the other side define the welfare state. And immigration can affect both tax rates and the quality and quantity of public goods and services provided by the government. Now, importantly, it seems from research that voters are aware of these effects of immigration on taxes and per capita benefits. So when they form an opinion about migration, they seem to realize that migration has these fiscal effects. So I have worked myself in this literature. I have a paper with Giovanni Facchini, and there is also another set of papers on the same topic where we all look at the drivers of public opinion on migration. And welfare state drivers seem to be quite important in terms of public opinion. In the paper with Giovanni Facchini, what we find is that voters think a lot about what might happen to tax rates when immigrants arrive. And so what we find is that when low-skilled migrants arrive, pretty much all voters have a negative view of migration because they realize that probably tax rates will have to go up, but rich individuals will have a more negative view than poor individuals, because rich individuals are negatively affected by tax rates increase more than poor ones. When high-skilled migrants arrive, it will be the opposite, in the sense that everybody pretty much will have a positive view of migration because tax rates will be able to come down, but again, all the action will be with high-income individuals who will benefit more with tax rates decreases relative to poor individuals. Hanson, Shiv, and Slaughter have a very nice paper along the same lines for the United States, and also Dasman and Preston, 2007. Now, it seems like voters also worry that when immigrants arrive, there might be an effect on benefits. And this is when low-skilled migrants arrive, or vice versa, there might be a positive effect on the quality and quantity of services when high-skilled migrants arrive. And that's the evidence in, for example, Hein-Mueller and Isfox, 2010. Now, what is really important is that it seems like fiscal effects in these public opinion polls are more important for individuals' assessments of immigration policies than concerns about wages or employment. This is what Dasman and Frattini, 2014, point out in their paper. And thinking about this point, this piece of evidence, my reaction is that it does make sense. To the extent labor market effects take place, they only affect one slice of the population. They only affect those individuals who are in competition potentially in the labor market with migrants. On the other hand, through the fiscal channel, to the extent tax rates change or per capita benefits change, everybody in the population will be affected. So it makes sense that these fiscal effects are broadly felt and so important in public opinion polls. Now, moving on, it seems like fiscal effects are also very important when one looks at the impact of migration on election outcomes. There is a growing literature in migration looking at these electoral effects of migration. So in a paper with Giovanni Peri and Walter Steingras, what we find is that in the United States, between 1990 and 2016, the arrival of low-skilled migrants increased the Republican vote share, while the arrival of high-skilled migrants had the opposite impact. It increased the Democrats' vote share, and this is at the county level. Now, these results are in part driven by fiscal effects, because what we find is that the pro-Republican effect of low-skilled migrants and the pro-Democrat impact of high-skilled migrants are more pronounced when government expenditures are high. So fiscal effects seem to matter for the impact of migration on election outcomes. Next, I'm going to make the point that from a policy point of view, so for policymakers, migration is very important, specifically from a fiscal channel point of view. In general, immigration can play an important role in contexts characterized by population aging. So there is a very nice paper by Borsch, Suppan, Leit, and Rauch, 2019, that broadly speaking looks at the impact of population aging on overall different aspects of an economy. Output, the capital stock, the labor force, growth, potentially offsetting effect of trade and capital flows, etc. And I discussed this paper, and this was the first time that I thought in detail about what role migration could play in a context characterized by population aging. And in particular, the fiscal perspective is quite relevant. So immigration can offset the impact, the fiscal impact of population aging. So how does this work? In many countries, there are pay-as-you-go pension programs. For example, Social Security in the United States. And in these programs, those who work now pay contributions that are used by the program to pay monthly incomes to today's retirees. Now, clearly, population aging can threaten the viability of these programs. And that's where migration can help. And the reason is that immigrants tend to be younger than the native population, and they tend to have higher fertility rates. So in terms of the latter point, in the United States, the total fertility rate of native-born and white non-Hispanic women is below replacement level. It's at 1.9, while the total fertility rate of Hispanic women is roughly 2.8, and this was prior to the Great Recession. So higher fertility rates of migrants, first generation or older generation migrants, but also if you look at the next figure, which is from the National Academy of Science report, you can see how different the age structure of migrants is relative to the native born. This is again for the United States. And this figure shows the population of first generation migrants. This is the bold line, and the population of native born Americans. This is the dashed line, the third class generation. And both these populations are represented by age category. And what you see is that immigrants, first generation immigrants, are much more concentrated in working age population because they tend to come when they are already above 18, and oftentimes they leave when they retire. Okay, so immigration can play an important role in contexts characterized by population aging. Next, I would like to make the point the fiscal effects are very important from a political economy point of view. And I'm going to talk about this theory in international relations, which is called embedded liberalism. Basically, this theory says that the welfare state has made it possible to manage opposition to globalization by public opinion. So some programs of the welfare state provide a safety net, as we all know. So they provide a system of support for those who experience a negative shock because of globalization. And since right after World War II, many governments have used the tool of the welfare state more and more. They have increased public expenditures a lot to provide this safety net. And this is shown, for example, by Danny Roderick in a very nice paper in 1998 that shows that more open countries have bigger governments. So in this sense, the welfare state becomes a government tool that allows the government to save globalization without giving up on democracy. Now, this mechanism can work and has worked quite well in the case of trade liberalization and capital flows liberalization. But with immigration, this mechanism may stop working. Why? Well, when immigrants arrive, they can have a direct impact on the welfare state. And in particular, I'm going to emphasize the impact that arises in this last bullet point. They can have a political economy impact by affecting how much natives are willing to redistribute income within their societies. So the story is that when immigrants arrive, they increase the heterogeneity in the population. And people in general don't like to redistribute income to people who are different from them. And so this reduces the willingness of people to redistribute income. So preferences for redistribution are negatively affected by the greater racial, ethnic heterogeneity of the population that immigration implies. And there is a large literature on that, for example, by Bertalesina and La Ferrara, Lutmer, Miano, Stanceva, Murar, Rappaport, Hillel Rappaport. And this is a very important point because it basically tells us that migration can undermine the very same tool the governments can use to manage opposition to migration. So basically, I made the point many different ways that fiscal effects of migration are really important. So now what I want to do is to spend a little bit of time talking about what we know about these fiscal effects, what literature there is out there about fiscal effects. And I will talk about the specific case of the United States, but the US case is quite representative of other destination countries. So interestingly, only few academic papers empirically analyze the fiscal effects of immigration. There are more policy papers, but only a handful of academic papers, especially in the case of the United States. And importantly, these academic papers that analyze fiscal effects use a methodological approach, which is quite different from what the rest of the migration literature has used to empirically analyze economic impacts. So in particular, there are some papers that follow an accounting methodology. This is, for example, the National Academy of Science report, the very nice papers by Auerbach and Aureopoulos, 1999 and 2000, the older paper by Borjas, 1994. So in these papers, what people do is to construct a measure of how much in taxes immigrants pay and how expensive public programs used by immigrants are, and then they take a difference between these two quantities, these two values. And they do that either for 1 year or for the life cycle of a generation, of a cohort of migrants. Next, there are some other papers that develop a macro model and simulate the effect of immigration on government's revenues and expenditures. For example, the very nice paper by Storrs-Lepp in 2000. Now, these papers are very important. They have provided important empirical evidence to understand fiscal effects, but they also require a lot of assumptions. So especially if we are interested in the policy implications, I think the results are harder to use. So let me give you an example. In the National Academy of Science report, there are different results on fiscal effects depending on the assumptions that are made. So the report considers different scenarios. So you need to choose your favorite scenario to have a sense about the fiscal effects. And so the question is which scenario to use. And another aspect of the existing literature is that for the most part, it only considers the direct effect of migration from a fiscal point of view. So, for example, how much in taxes migrants pay and how expensive programs, public programs targeted at migrants are. But, you know, migrants can affect the destination economy from a fiscal point of view, also indirectly. So they can create, through the labor market channel, a migration surplus. And so they can increase the tax base corresponding to the native population. And so they can increase how much natives pay in taxes, because they may increase through that channel the average income of natives. There can be indirect effects through the house market, through price effects. And especially the papers based on the accounting approach tend not to consider these indirect effects. So when my co-authors and I, when Mine Senses and Walter Steingras and I started looking into this literature, we were surprised to find that at least as far as we know, there is no study that estimates the causal effect of immigration on public finances in the United States. Now, this is surprising, but at the same time, from a methodological point of view, it is also understandable because it is not clear which variation should be exploited in the data. The reason is that in most countries in the world, the welfare state is defined at the country level. And if you do the analysis at the country level, you don't have a lot of variation in the data to exploit. And you need to do a cross-country analysis that is not done that much anymore in the context of migration. Now, variation at the local level could be exploited, but then we need to make sure that there is fiscal autonomy at the local level. Because if there is no fiscal autonomy at the local level, so say, for example, that expenditures that take place in a given locality depend on an algorithm that determines transfers from the federal government to the local government. Then if we do the analysis at the local level, we are just capturing the impact of this algorithm, but we are not really capturing the impact of true variation in the data. Now, the case of the United States is different from this point of view, because at the local level in the United States, governments have quite a bit of fiscal autonomy. So they raise most of their revenues from own sources. Counties in the United States only receive slightly more than 1/3 of their revenues from the federal, from other parts of the government. This is the data from 1990 to 2010. So the rest of the revenues are from own resources, from locally raised revenues. And they tend to be property tax revenues and sales tax revenues, and just a little bit of income tax revenues. Now, this autonomy from a fiscal point of view on the revenue side also implies that counties in the United States can also choose as they wish how to spend this money. So there is autonomy also in terms of the decision of the provision of public services. Counties, local governments can decide and spend money on education, fire and police protection, parks and recreation, public transport, public housing for low-income families. So they decide on a bunch of public goods and services which are really important for voters. And local jurisdictions can tailor spending and service provision according to their local priorities. So political economic effects can be important as well. Now, the last point I wanted to make is that at the local level in the United States, local governments need to run a balanced budget, which is also relevant for the empirical analysis that we, my co-authors and I, carry out, that I will discuss next. So basically, in a very recent paper, this is work in progress, what we do is to estimate the causal impact of immigration on public revenues and spending at the local level in the United States. So we do a reduced form analysis by exploiting exactly this variation in the data at the local level. And what we do is to provide estimates both for overall migration, as well as for low and high skilled migration. We have a very rich data set on the fiscal side. This is a data set that was used by my co-author Mayda Census with Feller, which provides data broken down by items of revenues and items of expenditures. And finally, what we aim to do is to estimate a causal effect. So we employ a shift-share instrument, as is common in the migration literature. Now, those of you who are familiar with the migration literature will be aware of the recent literature that criticizes shift-share instruments, and in particular, the card instrument. This same literature recommends a bunch of robustness checks and checks of the exclusion restriction. And we do carry out this battery of tests in our paper, and they work very well. And they can be found in the draft of the paper. I'm not going to spend time on these checks, but I can show them to you if there are any questions. Now, before giving you a summary of what we find in this work, I would like to give you some more details about how this fiscal impact of immigration works. Basically, it can work through two channels. Immigration is a labor supply shock. It affects the size and composition of the population. And because of that, it implies a change in the average income in the locality where migrants go. And this is for a given size of the welfare state. Average income, or a function of average income, is the tax base over which tax rates are applied. So if immigration decreases average income, it means that revenues for the government will go down. Then there will be a deficit in the government's budget. And so the government will have to do something to bring back the budget to balance. So it will either need to change tax rates, for example, increase tax rates or reduce per capita benefits, or both. So this is the first way through which migration affects the local economy through the fiscal channel. The second channel is what I was talking about before, which is this political economy effect working through preferences for redistribution. But I'm going to focus on the first bullet point, and I'm going to make the point that from a policy point of view, the most important question is, are immigrants a net contribution, or are they a net burden for the public budget? This is the most important question. And the answer to this question from a theoretical point of view depends on the skill composition of migrants, which in turn affects the income of migrants. And it depends also on both direct and indirect effects, as I was telling you before. Now, from a theoretical point of view, low-skilled migrants are more likely to decrease per capita public revenues, and as a consequence, expenditures. And high-skilled migrants, from a theoretical point of view, are more likely to increase per capita public revenues, and as a consequence, expenditures. So now note that the indirect effects are the reason why we say more likely, because the indirect effects, so for example, the impact through the migration surplus through the labor market channel, can be so strong as to offset the direct effect. And so that's why these effects are not unambiguous. Now, the question becomes an empirical question. And so I'm going to show you our results, the main table. I'm going to show you only a couple of tables. So what do we find in this work between 1990 and 2010 at the county level in the United States? Our preferred specifications are in 2 and 4, where we include local control variables. What we find is that for the average county, an increase in the share, in the overall share of migrants, which is what we look at in these first two columns, does not have a significant impact on own revenues. So the effect, you can see, is insignificant, but importantly, it's also very, very small. So going back to the question from before, this most important question, what our reduced form empirical analysis finds is that at the local level, immigrants are neither a burden nor a net contribution. Now, if we differentiate between low-skilled and high-skilled migrants, we find that low-skilled migrants have a negative impact and high-skilled migrants have a positive impact.
Anna Maria, if I may just ask a clarification question, why is the relevant variable share of migrants?
I suppose, are you thinking about?
So I'm thinking about inflow of migrants increasing the size of labor force.
Yes.
And then changing the composition. So I sort of see two different channels. So I'm trying to understand why you focusing on share without looking at the labor size of the labor force.
So, you know, this comes directly out of the theory. What is relevant from a theoretical point of view is by how much immigration increases the existing labor force. This is when we look at the overall share of migrants, or by how much they increase the stock of low-skilled or high-skilled workers. So from a theoretical point of view, we have a very simple theoretical framework. It comes out directly from the model. From an empirical point of view, in the migration literature, there are different ways to capture the impact of migration, but I would say that looking at the share out of the resident population is the most common one. That's more theoretical. We decided to go ahead following quite precisely the predictions of the theoretical model, where the relevant variables are these shares out of the population. So the immigrants to resident population ratios.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So going back to these results, now what we find in terms of the impact of low-skilled and high-skilled migrants is that the predictions in the theoretical model, from a theoretical point of view, are borne out by the data. So there is this negative and significant impact for low-skilled ones and positive and significant impact for high-skilled ones. But when you look at the magnitude of the effects, they are quite small. So what we calculate based on the estimates in column 4 is that the increase in the share of low-skilled migrants between 1990 and 2010 in the United States, which was an increase by 3 percentage points, reduced per capita owned revenues by $217 per capita. But this is over a 21 years period. So it's like around $10 per capita. And we get very similar results on the expenditure side. So on the expenditure side, you see the magnitude of the effects is still positive for high-skilled migration, negative for low-skilled migration, but the magnitude of the effects is quite small, although these effects are precisely estimated. So let me basically first make the point that what we find is that in the average county, from a fiscal point of view, an increase in the share of migrants neither increases nor decreases public revenues and expenditures at the local level. The estimates are not significant and they're also very small. And let me compare what we find to what, for example, the National Academy of Science report finds. So this is a summary table for the effects in the report at the state and local level. Basically, what this report finds is that at the local level, county and state level, immigration is a net burden. The average immigrant generates a fiscal shortfall of $1,600 annually. Now, what is the big difference between what we do and what the National Academy of Science report does? Besides the fact that we do an estimation and they use an accounting approach, the other big difference is that they basically only consider the direct fiscal effect of immigrants. On the other hand, what we do is to account for both the direct and indirect fiscal effects of immigrants. Because note that our dependent variables are all public revenues at the local level. So when we look at revenues raised by a county level government, we look at taxes paid by both immigrants and natives. And when we look at public expenditures, we look at provision of public goods to both natives and migrants. So we are able to capture also these indirect effects that seem to matter, that seem to make the difference between a negative and a zero impact. Okay, so I basically already went over this other set of results, except the last bullet point. So what we find is that there is some partial insurance by the federal government for the local effects. For the local effects of low-skilled and high-skilled migration, which are significant. But this insurance is only partial. And getting into the smaller details, what we find is that most of the action in terms of revenues is in terms of property tax revenues. So property tax revenues are the most important source at the local level in the United States. And it is these property tax revenues that increase when high-skilled migrants come and decrease when low-skilled migrants come. And we investigate further what's behind this result, and we find that house prices increase when high-skilled migrants come and decrease when low-skilled migrants come. On the expenditure side, our most important result is related to the most important item of expenditure, which is expenditures on education. And there, we don't find an impact of neither the overall share of migrants, nor low-skilled, nor high-skilled migrants. And this actually makes sense because it is likely that that's exactly the aspect of expenditures where the federal government is jumping in. So this is probably thanks to transfers from the federal government. Okay, next, I know that maybe I'm taking a little bit more time, but I quickly wanted to show you a couple more results. We find that there is a lot of heterogeneity from a geographical point of view. So although for the average county, the fiscal impact of the increase in the average share of migrants is 0, for some counties positive, for some counties is negative. And this is both on the revenue side and on the expenditure side. Next, I want to spend a couple of minutes on something which is extremely important from a policy point of view, which is something that the National Academy of Science report focuses on. As a matter of fact, this figure is from that report. This figure shows the taxes paid by and the benefits received by 3 different groups. First generation migrants, second generation migrants, and native-born Americans with native-born parents. So the third generation, third-class generation. And what this figure shows is that the second generation migrants both contribute a lot in terms of taxes. They are the dotted line. They are above the other two red lines. And they received the least in terms of benefits. So again, the dotted blue line compared to the other blue lines. So the report by the National Academy of Science makes the point that the second generation migrants make a positive, very large contribution from a fiscal point of view. And we do confirm this result in our reduced form causal estimation. So in this table, what you see is that we find the second generation migrants. In other words, Americans, so people who are born in the United States, but whose parents were born abroad, tend to have a very positive, significant, and large impact on both own revenues and expenditures at the local level. Interestingly, if we control for both first generation and second generation migrants, both are instrumented, what we find is that the impact of the first generation migrants now becomes negative. So it is likely that before, in the zero impact that we were estimating, we were capturing in part the positive impact of second generation migrants who tend to co-locate with first generation migrants. So second generation migrants tend to live close to where first generation migrants from the same country of origin live. But this is a very important result because it tells us that even if the first generation may have a negative impact, think, for example, about the low-skilled migrants, when we get to the second generation, these effects are likely to become positive and significant and very strong. Finally, I wanted to quickly show you some initial results that we have on the other side of the welfare state. So, you know, the welfare state does two things. It redistributes income from the rich to the poor, but it also redistributes income from the young to the old. And this is related to what I was talking about at the beginning of the presentation. So eventually we would like to analyze this second aspect much more, but for now what we have done is to look at the impact of immigration at the local level on the old age dependency ratio. Now, the premise is that the news is not very good, even for the United States. We already knew that the situation was bad in Italy, in Japan, in European countries, but it looks quite bad for the US as well. By 2065, the US old age dependency ratio will have surpassed 60%. Well, what we find is that immigration can help from this point of view. Interestingly, we find that it is high-skilled migrants who decrease the old age dependency ratio. Okay, so now I see that I'm out of time, so let me conclude. What I hope I did is to convince you that fiscal effects are really important and we need to study them more in the migration literature. And they're even more important than for other parts of globalization because migrants have a direct effect from fiscal point. I showed you some results of mine, and we find evidence that at the local level, the overall effect is zero, but there is a lot of heterogeneity. I showed you that the second generation has a large positive fiscal impact, and in the long run, immigration can play a very important role by offsetting population aging. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Anna Maria. We have a question from the audience, which reads, most immigrants do not pay direct taxes, but have to contribute to indirect tax revenue through consumption.
Yes.
Right? That the US has low consumption taxes, while Europe has high. Yeah. How does this influence political economy in the US versus Europe, especially in terms of provision of welfare or public goods?
Well, so by the way, we do have in our breakdown of revenues, property tax revenues, sales tax revenues, and income taxes to a smaller extent. So sales taxes, you're right, they tend to be different across countries. At the local level, the more important they are, the more likely these effects are going to be pronounced. And so fiscal effects become more important where these local sources of revenue are more important. That's to the extent that the local government raises a lot of revenues through sales taxes, then these effects will be quite important, more important from a political point of view.
Thank you, Anna Maria. I just want to mention to the audience that you are encouraged to submit questions through Q&A. And my co-panelists, please drop me a note and raise your hand. I know that Danny wants to ask questions. So Danny, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Beata. Thank you, Anna Maria. This is fascinating, as everything you and Walter and Mina do always. One question is that I recently saw an ongoing work by Michael Clemens, where he added an additional aspect to this discussion, which is the capital, the taxation on returns to capital that arise from immigration. So, like for instance, which applies very much also to low-skilled or fundamental workers migration, like a cashier in a supermarket. You know, you need to buy the capital, and that will provide returns and taxation. Is your approach taking that into account? And if not, does that mean that it's perhaps maybe underestimating the low-skilled, the contribution of low-skilled migrants?
I think so. We basically account for all sources of revenues and expenditures, both by migrants and natives. So we should be able to capture this channel. And we may even be able to zoom in on this specific item because we have really, really detailed data. We haven't done so, but this is exactly, I think, the advantage of this reduced form approach. It is that by looking at all revenues and all expenditures, we are able to capture these indirect effects. Because to the extent that, say, an American has a business and it makes more revenue and that person, that individual pays more in taxes or there are more sales, then the revenues at the local level will increase. And we are able to capture that.
I guess what I missed on my question, which is, I mean, that's useful to understand, but there's also an intertemporal aspect there, which is that maybe the investment in capital will come after the flow. Which I didn't mention that, but there, if you're looking at simultaneous, you might be missing some of that.
No,
right?
You're right. So our analysis is not a super long run analysis. So for that, what we would need to do is to look at the impact of, say, stocks of migration in 1990, maybe on public finance variables 20 years later. I think we would need to run a first difference specification where we take advantage of these long-term changes. We haven't done so yet. We could do it, we don't have a ton of data because we have data between 1980 and 2010. We use the 80 variables for the instruments and the period of analysis is really 1990 to 2010. So there, I think we have less variation.
Anna Maria, if I may ask a question, what about congestion, right? So public provision of public goods may not be keeping up with the increased population, and now schools and parks and roads will be congested. That's an argument that was, I think, quite frequently made in the UK in the context of Brexit. Is there a way for you to take it?
So, you know, that's a really good question. Basically, what you're pointing out is that what matters is not only the quantity of public goods, but the quality of public goods. It's really difficult to measure the quality of public goods. So, for example, for education, we measure education expenditures. Now, in per capita, this is in per capita terms, but the quality may go down. So what we were thinking about doing is maybe look at student scores as a measure of the quality of the public good, of public schooling. But you're right that in some cases, the adjustment mechanism may be in terms of quality rather than quantity.
Thank you very much. Now let me give the floor to Kasper, who also has a question.
Yeah, so I have a question, but it's maybe an unfair question. I was just wondering whether there are any differences, you know, in the effects that you talk about, which are very interesting, between different countries with different income levels. So, you know, intuitively, you would think if you look at developed countries, developing countries, that in terms of, you know, public goods provision, in terms of tax revenues, they differ quite a lot. Do you think that these, you know, is there any evidence where we could say that the effects on, you know, the fiscal effects, that they actually differ between these type of countries?
Well, okay. So what matters from a theoretical point of view is the difference in income between immigrants and natives. So then you have to look at what kind of migrants come in, whether the migrants who come in are even poorer than the local population, in which case there will be more likely to be a negative impact. But it is true that if already the local population is quite poor, there is a higher chance that the migrants may not be poorer. They might be as poor as the native population, in which case you don't have much of an impact. What matters is basically the difference in income levels between natives and migrants. Now, another important point is that probably middle and low income countries tend to have smaller welfare states. And so then you would expect these effects to be less pronounced. So that's, I think, relevant from a political economy point of view. They have welfare states that have developed more recently. And so that might be why richer countries tend to be especially opposed to migration, because they do worry about this type of effects. They worry about, like, you know, all these services that we get in rich countries that might be threatened by the arrival of certain types of migration.
Thank you. And now we have time for a final question from Catherine.
Well, hi, thanks very much. My question is really quite general. It's very interesting to see such a concise description of how fiscal costs may be more contemporaneous, but benefits are longer term, felt over multiple generations. I wondered how often this distinction is part of the political economy, part of the debate, that, you know, the extent to which voters are long-sighted in the way they feel about immigration policy.
You know, that's a very good question. So if I think about attitudes, what I can tell you, so for example, if you look at attitudes towards migrants broken down by age, what you see, and you see it very clearly in the case of the United States, is that the older is the generation that you consider, the more opposed to migration voters are. So if you look at the generation that in the United States was born around World War II, they are really very, very opposed to migration. Instead, the younger, the millennials, and even after, they tend to be on average much more pro-migration. Now, one explanation could be that the younger generations realize that they will have to carry the burden in the long run of this, for example, of the effects of population aging, and migration can help from this point of view. But honestly, there hasn't been that much work on the political economy of migration in terms of these long-term effects. So that's more anecdotal evidence.
Well, sadly, we are out of time. So Anna Maria, thank you very much for a very informative talk. I think it's fair to say that most of us are guilty of looking mostly at labor market effects of migration. So thank you very much for broadening our horizons and making beyond the labor markets. I think this topic is extremely relevant to debates in many countries. This is the last seminar in our series, so I would like, at least for this academic year, so I would like to thank my seminar co-organizers, Catherine Thomas from the London School of Economics, Danny Bahar from Brookings, and Kasper Wrolik from German Development Institute. And of course, huge thanks go to Mandy Chen from the CEPR for making everything happen behind the scenes. Without Mandy, these seminars would have never taken place. So huge thanks to Mandy and to Anna Maria, my co-organizers, as well as to our audience.
Thank you, Beata.
Keep safe and see you at another event.
Bye.
Bye-bye. I think now we are still streaming. I think Mandy will turn this off. Mandy,